All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Catie's PhD dissertation defense. Catie is from beautiful Southern Rhode Island. I love that part of the country. I was in Bristol for 5 years when I was doing my PhD. And Catie went to Connecticut College for her undergraduate. And after graduating there, she worked for a number of different organizations on a variety of different projects. She worked on lionfish conservation and outreach down in the Florida Keys. And she was in San Francisco at the Tiburon Center working on some work, doing some work with zooplankton there and copepods, I believe. And she came to us in 2015. She's worked with us on a whole variety of projects. She's been doing a lot of surveying work in Belize with us on our long-term reef monitoring project. And she put together a really unique dissertation in Belize, based in Belize, combining both natural sciences, so what's going on the reef with the corals and the fishes and the seaweeds, how they're changing over time, and also management, so attempts by managers to slow or stop the kind of change in the reef system we've been seeing down there, and how the community, the fishing community all along the coast feels about it, and kind of how they're being involved in these conservation efforts. So it's a quite unique dissertation that it includes both quantitative social sciences and biological sciences underwater using scuba. So Catie used a whole variety of techniques to collect data for her dissertation project. So she's going to tell us about really just a small sliver of that, because that's all she can cover in this short time. And then we'll take questions from the audience for about 10 minutes. And then Catie's committee will meet with her privately for another hour or so, just mostly asking her questions and discussing the project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catie, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction, John. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you today what I've been up to for the last 5.5 years, where I've been assessing reef and fisheries management strategies in Belize using a social ecological systems approach. To begin, I'd like to highlight that fisheries are important for about 3 billion people each year across the globe, yet they're incredibly challenging to sustainably manage. Therefore, fisheries can be considered common pool resource systems. As common pool resource systems, the unregulated extraction and access of marine resources like the finfish pictured here, or other species like lobster, conch, and invertebrates can lead to overfishing of those resources, which then results in disruption of marine food webs and ecosystem functioning, and also disruption to livelihood benefits and food security for those 3 billion people. So current fisheries management strategies to address these issues include setting catch limits and quotas on individual species, and reporting and monitoring what fishers are catching and where they're catching those species. It also includes gear-based and spatial restrictions, so setting limits on gears like gill nets or long lines in deep areas, or setting up marine protected areas. But these methods often fall short due to a lack of resources and enforcement capacity to ensure that these methods are being followed by users. So a resulting method is the community-based fisheries management strategy, which combines understanding fisheries with the role that humans play in these systems, and include partnerships between fishers, consumers, managers, and scientists. And one of the goals of community-based fisheries management is to improve enforcement and promote increased environmental stewardship and lead to overall sustainability benefits. One example of community-based fisheries management is the Managed Access program in Belize. So to show you where Belize is, here it is in the southern Yucatan Peninsula. It borders Mexico, Guatemala, and a bit of Honduras. And it's home to the Belize Mesoamerican barrier reef system. And that is an incredibly diverse ecosystem. It's the second largest barrier reef system in the world. And as such, it also promotes a lot of ecosystem services, including as a source of fisheries and tourism for local economies. And the Managed Access Program in Belize is an example of a Territorial User Rights for Fishing Area, or TURF program, where pre-existing MPAs or marine reserves are paired with fishing areas where fishers are granted access rights to fish in one or two of the zones instead of the entire ocean. So it's a potential solution to an open access fishing regime. And in exchange for those access rights, fishers are required to report what they're catching to management officials and also color code their boats. And this program was first piloted in 2011 in Belize at the Port Honduras Marine Reserve and the Glover's Reef Marine Reserve, circled in white. And then in 2016, it was implemented nationwide. And this program is the result of over 40 years of evolving marine resource management in Belize, which leads to the overall objective of my dissertation, which was to understand and evaluate that evolution of marine resource management in Belize. To do this, I applied Elinor Ostrom's social-ecological systems framework to marine resource management. And this is because it provides a theoretical basis to examine the interactions and outcomes of social and ecological variables by defining the following four components. The first is the resource system, which outlines the natural resource system of habitats to be managed, and in Belize includes the Belize Barrier Reef. The next component are the resource units. These are the different marine species that come from the resource system and are managed by the governance system, which I'll get into, and include the queen conch, Caribbean spiny lobster, and a variety of finfish species in Belize. The next component are the users of the system, and these are the folks who are extracting the resource units from the resource system, primarily includes the fisher folk. The last component of this framework is the governance system, which describes all of the entities involved in setting the rules for extraction, access, and use within the resource system. And this includes individuals at the governmental level, like the Belize Fisheries Department, and non-governmental organizations or NGOs, like Tide and Sea. Each chapter of my dissertation focuses on a different component of this framework. And to provide you with what those are, in chapter 1, I look at the governance system by evaluating the robustness of institutions involved in fisheries management. In chapter 2, I describe and explain the changes to the Belize Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, the resource system in this case. And in chapter 3, I look at the users of the system by comparing the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of fishers towards the Managed Access Program. And first, I'll get into chapter 1. To evaluate the robustness of institutions involved in fisheries management, I was first interested in identifying the roles and structure of institutions involved, and then examine the impact of that institutional structure on the decision-making power, implementation, and overall future of fisheries management. To do this, I used a mixed methods approach that combined a review of secondary literature, semi-structured interviews with key informants at the governmental, NGO, and fishers levels in both 2017 and 2019, and also participant observation in fisheries forums, meetings, and presentations. One of those experiences is pictured here, where this was a meeting between fishers and managers of 2 of those managed access areas. I want to let you know that this chapter is very qualitative, and my description of it is going to be brief due to the interest of time, but I welcome any questions. So what did I find? I found that fisheries management in Belize can be broken into the following 4 main types of institutions. The first is the governmental level. The second is the tourism sector. Third is the NGO or non-governmental organizational sector. And the fourth represents the fishers. Now this structure right now represents an polycentric institutional structure because each of these is involved in the decision-making, implementation, and enforcement of fisheries policies. And each of these has their own set of rules, actors, and way of doing things. And I'll be showing an example of the structure of the fisheries sector to show you just how complex this really is, but understand that each of these 4 tiers is equally as complex. All right, and so each of these institutions, like the fisheries sector, is also an example of a nested structure because within this kind of overall umbrella, fishers can be broken into sport fishers, commercial fishers, or recreational fishers. And the focus of my research is the commercial fisheries sector. That can be further broken into the following types of institutions. The Belize Federation of Fishers, which is an NGO that works to advocate for fishers associations. Rainforest Seafoods, which is a wholesaler purchasing lobster and conch from the fishers and exporting them out of Belize. Next are the cooperatives, which also buy lobster and conch, but primarily sell them to resorts and restaurants within Belize. And not all fishers are members of those co-ops or cooperatives. Next are the individual fishers, every single commercial fisher in Belize for a given year. And then fishers associations. And those differ from co-ops in that they are based in individual coastal fishing communities and can advocate for the members of those communities at local, regional, and national levels. And individual fishers can be members of those associations, but not every fisher is a member of an association. And to show you just how complex those associations are, I found that there are 15 individual fishers associations representing really the spread of coastal fishing communities in Belize. And because of that, this is a very decentralized structure, which means that the decision-making power and the advocacy is on a very localized community level, which provides ways for members of these associations to self-organize, advocate for group benefits, which can lead to more collective action. So fishers who are members of these associations have more benefits than if they were acting alone. And so overall in this chapter, I concluded that fisheries management, implementation, and enforcement in Belize is polycentric, nested, and decentralized. Also, fishers associations are tools for collective action and empowerment, which overall lead me to conclude that this system of management has the potential to be a long enduring common pool resource system. Now, I know I didn't talk about that last point too much, but it was another main conclusion of this chapter that I'm happy to discuss during the question and answer section. Next, let's go into the resource system and understand what has happened to the Belize Mesoamerican barrier reef over the last 20 years. And to describe these changes, I wanted to ask, how have benthic community composition metrics changed along the Belize barrier reef following disturbance? These disturbances include things like increasing ocean warming, leading to increased bleaching events of coral, increased storms, and also disease. And how are those changes driven by local human impacts, ocean temperature, and MPA status? So whether a site was in a fully protected versus a not protected area. And to do this, I combined benthic imagery data from underwater video transects from the late 90s to 2016 and used generalized linear mixed models to determine the strongest drivers of reef change. And you see here on the right, this map demonstrates our study sites. About half of them were in those fully protected areas and about half were in non-protected regions. Now you might be wondering, why is it important to monitor these changes of this ecosystem over such a long period of time? Well, having a lot of this underwater monitoring data enables us to determine if there are any changes to these systems. We can track the ecosystem response. And like I said before, this is a key ecosystem for promoting biodiversity, but also providing ecosystem services to local and international economies. So this is a resource system for a lot of different people, and it's important to know how it's changing due to human impacts. And what did we find? Overall, I documented a decline in hard coral, which significantly declined from about average of 26% to an average of about 11%, and a significant increase in macroalgae from about 13% to an average of 40%. And these trends were found regardless of management regime. So even fully protected sites in the kind of dark purple experienced loss of coral and an increase in macroalgae over the duration of the study. And next, when I wanted to determine what the drivers of those community composition dynamics were, I built generalized linear mixed models with the following 4 fixed effects or predictor variables: year, MPA status, whether a site was fully protected or not protected, human influence as a proxy for local human impacts, and thermal stress, which is basically the number of times the sea surface temperature was above a certain threshold, which is a proxy for ocean warming. And what these 2 figures are going to show us are just how strong those relationships between the predictor variables on the left are with the response variables on the top, hard coral cover and macroalgae cover. If the points are going to be on the right side of 0, that will demonstrate a positive correlation. And if they're to the left, that will demonstrate a negative correlation. And what we found for hard coral cover was that year and thermal stress were both significantly negatively correlated with hard coral. So what that means is as year progressed, hard coral cover significantly decreased. And as thermal stress increased, as the ocean got warmer, hard coral cover subsequently declined. We've got similar yet different results for macroalgae cover. As year increased, macroalgae cover was positively correlated and also increased, which is basically kind of explaining the previous slide's figures. And then as thermal stress increased and the ocean got warmer, macroalgae cover decreased. And that makes sense because macroalgae, like coral, are sensitive to high temperatures. And the last key finding of this study was that I found 2 distinct benthic communities between early and late sampling years. And to determine this, I used non-metric multidimensional scaling, which is a method to visualize patterns in a data set. So these points all represent individual study sites and years. And if the points are more closely together, then the species in those sites are more similar. And if points are farther apart, then the species in those sites are more unique and more different. And these arrows are representing the species driving the location of the points on the plot. And when I say there are 2 distinct communities, we've got over here on the right, from the 1997 to 2005, communities dominated by stress-tolerant hard corals, including the Acropora and Orbicella genera. And then on the far left, we've got the communities of 2009 and 2016, dominated by weedy corals and fleshy macroalgae. And so we've got 2 individually distinct communities in the early and the late sampling years. And basically we've documented a decline in those stress-tolerant hard corals and have a different community in the later years. So we're managing a unique resource system now. Overall, in this chapter, I determined that thermal stress and time were significant drivers of hard coral and macroalgal cover over the duration of the study. Also documented 2 distinct ecological communities between the early and the late sampling years, which leads me to conclude that the Belize MPA network has fallen short in mitigating reef degradation following disturbances, because those even protection code was not able to mitigate those changes in communities. And lastly, looking at chapter 3, I was interested in comparing the attitudes, knowledge, and practices of fishers towards the Managed Access Program between 2014 and 2019. And to remind you about the Managed Access Program, here we have it mapped out on the far right. 2011, the pilot sites were first established, and in 2016, the additional sites were added nationally. In 2014, there was a baseline fisher survey about the fishers' knowledge, attitudes, and practices towards fishing, and also to see what they knew about the Managed Access Program before it was implemented nationally. And then I was most interested in 2019 in doing a follow-up, comparing the responses of fishers in 2019 to those in 2014. And this was a case study in southern Belize, where I traveled to the following, or these 10 communities from Dangriga down to Barranco to compare and understand the impact of managed access participation on the fisher folk. It's really important to get their buy-in when it comes to establishing new fishing practices and rules. To do this, I partnered with the local conservation organizations Tide and Sea, and then trained and hired 8 field assistants pictured here to work with me and travel to those communities. While we were there, we administered a 50-question quantitative survey using the Open Data Kit, or ODK, software on electronic tablets. And then I conducted about 20 key informant interviews with participating fishers. So that was basically, if a fisher was really interested in talking with me a little bit more about their perspective, then we just kind of went and chatted, and I asked them a few key questions. And I compared the key responses between 2014 and 2019. And to do these surveys, we went to fishers' homes, the dock sides, the fish markets, and community centers and schools to make sure we talk to enough folks. And between the 2 years, the population surveyed were pretty similar and representative of the commercial fishing population in Belize, and especially in southern Belize. So this is showing kind of a comparison, the number of individuals surveyed, their highest level of education, and I'd say that probably the only big difference is the median age in 2014 was a little bit lower than in 2019. Interesting to note is that about 30% of respondents live with over 5 people in their household, and oftentimes these are multi-generational households, so these fishers are providing for a lot of folks. And next, fishers were asked to express their knowledge about the Managed Access Program in both 2014 and 2019, and they were read a series of statements and asked to say either no, yes, or they weren't sure to the answer. And I was most interested in comparing the counts for each of these responses between the 2 years. So I conducted chi-squared tests to see if there were significant differences in the responses between those years. And I found that for 2 of the statements, fishers are required to record their catch, and there are benefits to having managed access rights, that there were statistically significant differences in the responses for the 2 years. So for example, for the first statement, the fact that there were 85% of fishers that said yes, fishers are required to record their catch, that was significantly more than the 55% that answered yes in 2014. And the similar results were also found for the statement, there are benefits to having managed access rights, or more folks saying yes in 2019. What I find interesting also is that even though the differences were not significantly different between the 2 years, for the middle 2 statements, I know the requirements to obtain a managed access license, and I know the terms for managed access license renewal. Over 55% of respondents in both years say yes. I do know how to get a license and how to renew a license, which shows that some of the education and outreach tools that the managers are using are in fact informing the users. And now they weren't just asked yes or no to respond yes or no to these questions. I also had them list at least one of the requirements to double check that they actually knew those rules. And next in 2014, fishers were asked questions to understand their perceptions towards the enforcement and rule following portion of managed access. And I understand that these are a little bit small, but what I want you to understand is that we've got the statements on the far left, and to these statements, fishers were asked to indicate the level to which they agreed or disagreed with the statement on a 5-point Likert scale listed below. One of the most important pieces of information is that for this statement, I have seen fishers fishing without a license. 72% of respondents either agree or strongly agree that, yes, I have seen fishers fishing without a license. And that indicates that they're identifying users in their area who aren't really allowed to be there. And furthermore, for these following 2 points, illegal fishing in the marine reserves has declined and enforcement has improved under managed access. It's almost split 50-50, but kind of leaning more towards the strongly disagree side. Particularly, enforcement has improved under managed access. 40% or 49% of users disagree with that statement. And the key informant interviews also revealed a lot of criticism to the managers about the lack of enforcement capacity by them. So overall, in this chapter, I found that most fishers know the rules to get and renew their licenses, and there was a significant increase in the knowledge about catch reporting from 2014 to 2019. So those educational tools that the managers are using could be working. However, many in 2019 perceive a lack of enforcement as an obstacle to success. However, maybe fishers working in those fishing associations can potentially self-police their areas, fill the gaps in enforcement evident in the managers. Overall, this interdisciplinary work informs marine resource management decisions in both Belize and in other small-scale fisheries contexts. So this was really interdisciplinary, and I combined marine ecology with social science to understand marine resource management policies in Belize. I would say the biggest takeaway of this work is that now we're managing an ecologically unique and since disturbed reef system, therefore requiring increased partnerships between different stakeholders, the fishers, the scientists, and the managers. Everyone needs to come together. And I think a way for that to happen is by fishers increasing their involvement in the enforcement and utilizing their partnerships in those associations. And I also want to, these kind of incentives can encourage environmental stewardship, increased collective action, and promote long-term fisheries sustainability in these communities. And these lessons learned in Belize can be applied to other small-scale fisheries contexts, particularly in countries that are also implementing these kind of turf reserve systems, like in the Philippines and Indonesia. So it's really interesting to see, you know, what worked and what didn't work in Belize, and how can we inform management in those contexts. And that really concludes the work. But it would not be possible without the generosity of these funding sources. And I'm really appreciative to all of them for making this work possible, and for making it possible for me to spend so much time in Belize working with these different communities and fully understanding just how complex marine resource management is in that one place. And I also want to thank the variety of people who made this work possible. First and foremost, the in-country collaborators who I've been working with for over 3 years now, particularly at the Belize Fisheries Department, at Tide at Sea, and at the National Institute for Culture and History for giving me some research permits, and for helping me contextualize the complexity of resource management where they live. I also want to thank the 8 field assistants who worked with me and traveled with me to those fishing communities over 3 months in 2019. Thank you so much for your patience and your help with my field work. I also want to thank the fishers who organized meetings in their own communities, and they really helped us have a good turnout when we visited their communities and tried to talk with the other fishers there. Thank you also to the 485 anonymous fishers whose perceptions and understanding of managed access we are amplifying through this work. And thank you especially to everybody past and present in the Bruno lab for your feedback, guidance, and support, and for making me a better scientist and person. Thank you also especially to my dissertation committee for your patience, feedback, and encouragement. And we all knew that this kind of interdisciplinary work was going to be challenging, but thank you for never discouraging me from doing it. I think I really, really grew through your mentorship, and I appreciate all of that. And also thank you to the following individuals at UNC, either at the Carolina Population Center, in E3P, or in biology for your administrative assistance and mentorship. I'm going to try and keep it together, but now I want to thank my graduate school friends in biology and ecology, and some who are pictured here, some who are not, but you know who you are, for your friendship and mentorship as we navigated, oh boy, the challenges and triumphs of graduate school. Thank you especially also to the Humphreys Lab at the University of Rhode Island for promoting group collaborative vibrations and for all the support as I completed my PhD away from UNC. Thank you everybody for becoming a part of my community during and beyond our time in graduate school. I'm also grateful for the friendships those who weren't in graduate school with me, but provided much appreciated guidance, support, and love from near and afar. I know one of you, it's very early where you are right now, and thank you. And thank you also to everybody at Narrow River Kayaks for making the last 3 summers so enjoyable and fulfilling. I'm also incredibly grateful to my family who have supported me and loved me as I followed my dreams. Thank you for supporting me, even if you didn't know what I was doing or why. And lastly, I want to express how thankful I am for my partner, Mitch Champlin, for your unwavering support of my professional and personal pursuits. You always believed in me, even if I didn't believe in myself. So thank you. Oh boy! And with that, thank you everybody for joining in. And I open the floor to any questions you may have. Thank you. Now, how are we going to do this? Am I managing the questions?
Yeah, so you can click on Q&A, and I think you have a couple comments there.
Okay.
You can't see them on screen.
We have to end the screen sharing because I have to.
You don't have to, but you can.
Okay. 1 second. Oh, thank you. Yes.
Your
Okay.
question.
I have 2 screens and one is not facing me. Okay. Yeah, do I click? Thank you for using the question and answer.
So if you click on Q&A at the bottom, there's a.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So first, and keep me on track for time because I know our time is limited. From Colleen, your Chapter 2 results suggest that MPAs are not doing enough to protect stony corals. Do you have suggestions on what the Belize government could do to support the reefs? Did the fisher folk have similar concerns or suggestions about the state of the reefs? Thank you for that question. Yes, I do have suggestions for the government. And part of our partnership in the permit process is a few reports that I'll be sharing with them. Excuse me. Suggestions for what the Belize government can do to support the reefs. I think increased funding to the different NGO managers who are really doing a lot of the enforcement and monitoring of the reefs. That's very important, including like providing funds for boat repairs and maintenance and funding the rangers who are out on the water, but also understanding that these systems are a little bit different now And it's important to have somebody in place in-house to understand what's changing to the reefs. And fishers did have similar concerns. They know what's happening to the reef system, and they understand that it is a little bit different now. So thank you for your question. Got another question from Max. Fantastic job, thank you. What techniques can fishers and Belize fisheries do to reverse coral decline? So I don't know if it's really an issue about reversing the coral decline, but preventing further decline of species that are present in these areas. And so some things that I recommend that they do are, you know, advocate for decreased carbon emissions. I know it's hard in Belize, they're not really producing the carbon emissions that are contributing to ocean warming, but they can advocate for that on international levels. But they can also potentially even support a few of the local-based reef restoration projects that are actually doing pretty good work here. And that concludes the questions. Most of them are just supportive, so thank you, everybody. Does anybody else have a question? I recommend you use the question and answer format, unless you want to, I don't know, raise your hand and we can let you go. Oh, I didn't scroll down. Okay. Okay. Lauren has a question. Oh, thank you, everybody. Are there any, or from Annie, are there any coral restoration efforts going on? Yes. The Fragments of Hope NGO based out of Placencia, Belize, has been doing a lot of coral restoration work. I don't know too much about it, but I know that whatever they're doing is doing a pretty good job on a very local level. They have a lot of volunteers and a lot of interest. And they're planting more than just the acropora, that kind of big branching coral. They're planting some of the brain and the boulder corals as well. So they're really trying to diversify what they're planting. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Do you see the question from Elaine just a little bit below that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Elaine. The question is, how do you think class/socioeconomic status plays a role in perceptions and enforcement? I'm thinking of your chapter 3 specifically. That is a great question, and something that I still have to kind of delve into it, but I think it does play an important role in the perceptions by the fisher folk, particularly in southern Belize. It seems like there are two kind of main groups of folks: people who have been fishing, or maybe three groups. People who've been fishing for decades of time and only fish primarily for their source of livelihood. People who've been fishing for a while but diversify what they're doing. Maybe they're also tour guides, maybe they're taxi drivers, and so they're less reliant on the fish product for their livelihoods. And then you've got kind of a newer, younger generation of fishers who fish, but they also diversify. So I think a lot, and I've been interested in looking at this to see if there is a difference between the perceptions of folks based on their kind of livelihood strategy, because some of the folks who do particularly go into tourism are, they kind of understand, like, if I go into tourism, then I'm just leaving the fish on the reef and I can still make money off of this. But it's particularly been a challenge, especially this year, with a lack of tourism in these places. So a lot of fishers have just been not turning to commercial fishing, but just subsistence fishing. So yeah, definitely an important thing to take into consideration that I want to explore more.
Catie, you have a question from Kira. What was the biggest challenge you encountered in doing this research?
Thank you for that question. The biggest challenge, I think one of the biggest challenges was like conducting an international study and having enough, I guess, like confidence in myself that this can happen, even if I didn't do it before. And just going in and being really open with the people that I was meeting and talking to, and knowing that if I didn't have the answers, then I would sure figure them out. Thank you for that question. Steve
Stephen
Loomis,
asks,
yes,
yeah, go ahead.
hello. Okay, thank you. He's asked, what's the role of the National Park Service in fisheries management? I hope you're talking about Belize because I don't know too much about the other situations. So particularly, well, in Belize, mostly the fisheries department is the main kind of manager, and they oversee a lot of the like development of fisheries policies, but also they work with the NGOs to implement those policies and change them. So they kind of are like a big umbrella that oversees a lot of the policies, but then has a lot of information going in and out. Question from Lauren. Do you have a sense of any of the drivers of low compliance for the licensing system, i.e. the high incidence of fishers saying they've seen people fishing without a license? I think so. So anecdotally, I understand that in southern Belize, there's a lot of transboundary fishers. So folks coming in from other countries doing a lot of fishing at night. These are kind of roving divers, as we call them. And so they just come in and fish wherever they want to, and they don't have licenses, and they try not to get caught. I think another issue, and I'm just going to say it, there's a lot of corruption there, and fishers buying off the rangers. If they get caught doing what they're not supposed to, but they can pay, then they don't get an infraction. So that's a big issue there too. Wow, these are a lot of, hello, more questions. How are we doing on time? Do you want to cut me off? I want to be respectful of time, and we've got 3 more questions.
I think you're doing okay. It's 8:45.
Okay.
I forget what the plan was, when to stop the questions, but I think
I'll answer the next 3.
Okay, cool.
A question from the Hoffman Lab at University of California, Santa Barbara. Good morning. It's very early there for you. What are my next steps? Well, I want to continue to write up some of these chapters for publication in peer-reviewed journals. It'd be really nice if I could continue this important work that I've been doing in Belize, particularly working with the fisher folk and the natural resource managers. But I also hope to potentially work maybe in a nonprofit sector to bring my knowledge to other fisheries contexts elsewhere. I am still looking for my next full-time position. Next question from Ashley. How many enforcement folks are there, and what is the distribution of enforcement across areas? Is it equal? Great question. Varies by, so remember those areas for managed access, there's 8 main ones. Each site has anywhere from like 2 to like 4 enforcement fisheries officers. And I think the biggest challenge is not just the number of people, but how much fuel they have to go on their patrols each month. And so sometimes they pick and choose, okay, like this week we didn't go out at night, so like let's go on a patrol at night, but that's pretty costly for them to patrol a really large area. And so I think the number of enforcement officers has to be related to the area of the managed access area, like the quantitative area there. And our last question from Becca. Thank you for your question. Can you share a bit more about how you have been sharing and communicating your findings with partners in Belize? Yes, so a lot of what I've been doing is doing a few like meetings and presentations with partners in Belize throughout this process, even this year. And we're also working to co-develop a few publications for peer-reviewed journals. And I'm also preparing a few reports that I'll send to them. But it's kind of complicated when I'm like trying to get these papers out to journals, but I want to translate the findings to the managers there. And also, again, a part of our permitting process is sharing with them like the raw and the metadata so they can, you know, do this work. But really just kind of keep in contact with them however we can, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook. Yeah, so thank you everybody for your questions, and I can follow up with you individually for those of you whose questions I didn't get to.
Okay, well, that ends the public portion of Catie's defense. thanks again for coming, and you'll be hearing from us in an hour or two. And the rest of us, Catie, do we stay on this channel? Is this where we're going to?
So we'll go to a separate meeting,
Okay.
just me and the committee, and that's in the email, but yeah, so we'll go off.
Okay.
All right, thank you everybody, have a good day.